Today is an outstanding day in the life of Christians. It's an outstanding day because of what historically took place, but even more so, what Jesus, on riding into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, was representing and what he was doing, and what that has to say about our lives. See, we've been talking about what it really means to worship. We've been talking about the fact that worship means to bow down before the Lord and to submit oneself, to yield oneself, to acknowledge that God is King, that God is Lord, that He and He alone is worthy to be praised, that He is the sovereign, and that He is God over all the universe. We've extended that to say that worship means to go not just do things within the context of a service of worship, but to carry that out into our lives and to labor for the Lord, to serve the Lord, to give Him our choices, our decisions, our behavior, our ideas, our thoughts, our words. These are all acts of worship on our part. Today we come to another aspect of worship, which is a little bit more specialized, but one that talks about what Jesus did on Palm Sunday and during that week, and especially the night that He was betrayed and the following day. Interestingly enough, it is a word that is usually translated not worship, but minister. It is translated to minister unto the Lord. The word in Hebrew that carries this idea of ministering unto the Lord, which means to perform certain acts of service, certain acts of worship, is the word sharat. Sharat is the word that was always used to talk about what the Levitical priests did when they came into the temple. They were the acts of worship that they would do. They were the songs of praise that they would lift unto the Lord. It was the sacrifices that they would offer. These were the sharat. These were the duties that they would perform as they ministered unto the Lord. But interestingly enough, it broadened. It wasn't just the ritual actions that they did. It was the role that they played. You see, in the role that they had in the life of Israel, the priesthood stood in a unique position, kind of, you might say, at an intersection. The intersection between God and man. The priest would come before the Lord with the needs of the people. And they would offer to God as the people's representative, expressing to God what the people needed. And then on the other hand, they were spokespeople for God as they would share with the people what God was saying. And so they played this role of intercessor. They played this role of go-between. They played this key role. And as they offered the sacrifices of the people unto the Lord, and then they would turn and they would pronounce the name of the Lord back on the people, there was this back and forth process of God to the people and the people to God, and back and forth, so that the interchange took place. And the key role in that was the priesthood. The Levitical priesthood, and especially the role of the high priest, who had that unique position of being able to represent in himself the fullness of God's people. As he and he alone was allowed to go into the holiest place in all of Israel, that place that was called the Holy of Holies, the holiest spot on the earth, the place where the Ark of the Covenant had once sat, where God had made His presence known, the place where God had said, I will meet with you, the place where God sat on the mercy seat, the covering over the ark, as He sat there enthroned on the wings of the cherubim. Only the high priest could go into that place. But he went in, not for his own sake, but he went in on behalf of all the people and carried before the Lord the burdens and the needs of the nation. And then came forth from that to tell to the people what God would have them to be and what God would have them to do. This was the role of the priesthood as it functioned. And this kind of service unto the Lord was what is referred to as the Shabbat. In fact, the word is often put into a participle form, and it means a minister or an attendant unto the Lord. One who attends the needs of the Lord. I said, wait a minute. The Lord doesn't have needs. Well, not in the sense we think, but God says there are certain things I need from you. I need your praise and your worship. I need to commune with you. It is the very nature of me that wants this. And so the priesthood stood in this peculiar and special place before the Lord. The service that they rendered was referred to as avodah or avodah. And it comes from the word avad, which means to labor, but it was a special labor. It wasn't menial tasks. It was very special work. It was the work of offering the sacrifices unto the Lord. And that was a heavy responsibility. Because in order to do that, God had said something special about His priesthood. This priesthood is going to have to be set apart. This priesthood is going to have to be consecrated unto me. This priesthood is going to have to belong to me. This priesthood is going to be my people. In fact, the Levites gave up, at God's command, gave up any claim to the land. They had no inheritance in Israel. Their inheritance was in God. He claimed them 100%. They became His possession. They belonged to the Lord. Their lives were completely dedicated to the service of the Lord, however God might direct them. And so this word sharat refers to one who serves as an attendant to the Lord, one who does the will of God, one who serves the whims, the desires, the wishes, the commands of the Lord. And they dedicated their lives to that completely. Because of that, the Levites became known as separate from all the rest of the people. When they were numbering Israel, they would number Israel, but they would number the Levites separately because God said they are a separated people. They are consecrated unto the Lord. Now, with that background, I want us to look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. If you're using a Pew Bible, it's page 1888. Peter is writing about Jesus the Christ and how He became a stumbling block for so many. And then he turns to the believers in Jesus as the Messiah, and he writes, but you, now he's talking to them collectively, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His wonderful light. Do you realize what Peter is saying there? And it's said in other places as well. He is saying about those who accept Jesus as the Messiah, who become believers in Jesus, who become His followers, you are made into a kingdom of priests. You are all priests unto the Lord. You are a holy nation, a chosen people. You are a people that God has set apart to belong to Him. You no longer belong to the world. You are no longer part of the world. You now have been, just like the Levites, you have been consecrated into the priesthood, and God has claimed your life. He has set you apart, and now you belong to Him, and your job is to declare praises. That was part of the avodah. That was part of the rendering service unto God. Your job is now to minister unto the Lord with your life, so that others can see the glory of God through you. You are no longer like the rest of the world. You are no longer like everyone else. You are now different from everyone because God has set you apart and He has consecrated your life. He has claimed your life. He has bought you. He has paid for you. He has given His life for you. You are now His. He owns you. And He claims you. And He says, I will not share you with the world any longer. You are mine, and I lay claim to your life. And so I consecrate you into the priesthood. And now you are to come before the Lord, offering the sacrifice of life. And you are to minister unto the Lord, and you are to wait on the Lord, and you are to serve the Lord, and you are to be obedient to the Lord, and you are to do what God wants you to do, because that's what His servants do. And He said, this is worship. This is worship. Ministering as God's priests unto the Lord. Just as the Levites gave up their inheritance in the land, He tells us, give up your inheritance in the ways of the world. Don't try to hold on to your natural heritage, but instead find your inheritance in me, He cries. Because your hope is no longer in this world. Now your hope is in me. Now you belong to me. Now your future is written in me. And so I lay claim to you because you are mine for all eternity. And so He lays claim on His people. And so Peter writes to them, you are a special people. Not special because you're so good, but special because of what God is doing to you and what God has done for you and the way God is going to use your life. He has made you into a kingdom of priests to minister unto the Lord as His attendants who wait upon the Lord and serve the Lord. Now you see why it's important for us to understand who we are. Now you see why it's important that we understand what worship is to be about. We're not just people who come in and say nice things about God, submit to the Lord, and then try to live good lives. We are now a kingdom of priests. And the ownership of who we are has shifted. The ownership is no longer us. We no longer own ourselves. We now belong to the Lord. When He numbers the citizens of the world, He no longer numbers us among the citizens because we are no longer part of the kingdom of this world. We are now part of the kingdom of God. And He numbers His priests separately than He does all of the persons. Because they are set apart. And they are holy unto the Lord. And therefore, the role of the priesthood is to be both the intercessor who takes the needs of the world before the Lord and the role of the spokesperson who takes the word of the Lord to the world. The one who stands as a go-between is no longer just one man. It is no longer just a small group of people. It is no longer a matter of natural birthright. Now it's a matter of spiritual birthright. We have been birthed into the kingdom of priests, and now we stand in that special place. We are the sanctuary of God. We are the temple of God, and we bring the sacrifices before the Lord, and we offer up on behalf of ourselves and on behalf of others the prayers of intercession, and we offer on behalf of God the word of truth that changes lives and changes the world. This is what the role is all about. It's the role of the reconciler. It's the role of the peacemaker. It's the role of the one who restores relationships. And how do we do this? We do it by ministering unto the Lord in a very special way. Because you see, to take this seriously, to really do this, it's going to take commitment on the part of our lives. So you can't belong to God 100% and not be committed. You cannot belong to God 100% and still ride the fence. You cannot belong to God 100% and still play the world's games in your mind and in your priorities and then expect God to accept what you give to Him on a Sunday morning. He says you have to be consecrated to me completely. Your whole lives, every part about you. There is no part of your life, no part of your thoughts, no part of your words, no part of your reactions or your responses that is not supposed to be committed unto the Lord. As Paul says, everything you do, do as unto the Lord. Everything. How do you do that? Paul writes about it in Romans 12, verse 1. If you would look there. Romans chapter 12, verse 1, page 1763 in the Pew Bible. Paul lays out for us here how we are to do this service of God. He begins in verse 1. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Now, when he says your spiritual act of worship, what he is using there is a Greek word which was used in the translation of the Hebrew Bible when it was translated from Hebrew into Greek, called the Septuagint, which gives us a good frame of reference of what these Greek words correspond to in Hebrew. He is using the Greek word that was used by the translators of the Septuagint to refer to the avodah, the sacrifices offered by the Levitical priests in the temple. What he is saying here is that offering your bodies as a living sacrifice unto the Lord is the same thing as the priests coming before God and offering the sacrifices. It is the sacrificial offering that God desires. Where he says, I desire obedience rather than sacrifice. And he says, so offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, and you place it upon the altar of the Lord, and it is just as though you were in the temple in Jerusalem, and you were placing a sacrifice before the Lord. In fact, he says it's more pleasing to God because it's the sacrifice that he desires the most. Well, how do you offer your bodies as a living sacrifice? What does that mean? He explains it in verse 2, and he goes on. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. How do I offer my body as a living sacrifice? How do I render ministry unto the Lord? How do I serve the Lord? And he says, it's more than just saying, God, you're great. It's more than saying, God, you're in charge. It is literally saying, God, here I am. Consume me. Here I am, the sacrifice. Burn up the impurity in my life. Here I am, the sacrifice. Change the way I think. Change the way I respond. Change the way I react. If there are things of my personality, let me not hold on to them, but let them be burned away if they're displeasing to you. Change my very being if necessary. He says, do not be conformed to this world any longer. You can't be conformed to the world and be a priest set apart by God. Because when he sets you apart, you are set apart from the ways of the world. That means you do not order your lives the way the world does. Your priorities are not going to be the same as everyone else's. That means the value system you hold to is not going to be the same as everyone else. That means the God you listen to and obey is not going to be the same that everyone else follows. Because you are now devoted to the Lord. And Paul says, so no longer be conformed, be patterned after the ways of the world, the thinking patterns of the world. Don't think that way anymore, but allow your mind to be changed. Allow your mind to be renewed so you begin seeing life in a different way, in a totally different perspective. You start looking at life as God's children, as God's priesthood, holy unto the Lord. You offer yourselves as a living sacrifice, and you are consecrated. You literally must die to the world and die to your own wishes, your own ideas, your own rights, and submit yourself and say, I don't belong to me anymore. I belong to God. That's what Jesus was talking about when Satan came before him and he said, bow down and worship me. When he says, it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and he only shall you serve. When he uses the word serve, he uses the same word or a form of the same word that Paul is using here. He is saying that to the Lord is the only one you offer yourself as a sacrifice to. You do not place yourself as a sacrifice on any altar except the altar of the Lord, and you must place it there because the Lord claimed you. Do you remember in the Passover when God said, I will let the lamb die instead of your firstborn? Later in the book of Numbers, he says, I claim all firstborn children as mine, all firstborn sons, they belong to me. There was an offering that parents would have to take. Mary and Joseph had to take the same offering up to Jerusalem to redeem their firstborn. It's part of the custom. But God said of the children of Israel, he said, now number the firstborn sons in Israel. And they numbered 22,273. And he said, now number the Levites, the Levitical priesthood. And they numbered 22,000. He said, I'll trade for every firstborn son that I could claim. I'll trade you a Levitical priest. I want them for mine. They redeem the firstborn sons. They had 273 left over, and they had to do special offering for those 273. But he said, instead of claiming the firstborn sons, I want those who are going to be priests unto me. And I lay claim, and they shall sacrifice themselves to the Lord. That's what it means to be the priesthood of the Lord. Now, David Stern, writer of the Jewish New Testament, took 1 Peter 2:9, and as he translated it and using some of the Hebrew words and what they actually referred to, he captured in this translation exactly what God is trying to say, what it means to offer yourselves as a living sacrifice. I'm going to read 1 Peter 2:9 as David Stern translates it in his translation of the New Testament. But you are a chosen people, the king's Kohanim, that means priests, a holy nation, a people for God to possess. And that's what makes us priesthood. A people for God to possess. If somebody asks me, are you possessed? I'm going to say yes. I'm possessed by the Lord. He owns me. He lives within me. He has claimed my life. Yes, I am possessed. That's what I'm supposed to be. Possessed by God. How can I do that? Only if I offer Him my life as a sacrifice. Now do you see what Palm Sunday and Holy Week, why it is so important? What did Jesus do? Jesus, who is the King. Jesus, who is the high priest. Jesus, who is the perfect intercessor, who is the go-between between man and God, the only one who can truly represent mankind before the Lord and who can truly represent the Lord to mankind. This perfect priest offers himself as a sacrifice. He gives his life on behalf of the people. He dies to himself. He gives his blood so that others do not have to die. He plays the role of high priest in exactly the way that it's supposed to be according to God's way. He comes into the presence of God and he lays down his life. He who had the right to claim kingship, the right to rule over all things, lays down his life so that we might live. And then he says to us, this is the pattern. This is what I want you to do. I want you to be willing to lay down your life. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have to die physically. It doesn't mean, although that's not beyond possibility. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be sacrificed physically in order to lay down our lives for the Lord. He says, I want you to lay down your life. That is the ultimate act of worship. It is the sacrifice of the minister who lays himself upon the altar. It would be in the story of Abraham and Isaac, not that Abraham tied his son and laid him upon the altar, but that Isaac laid down. In fact, in Jewish thinking, as they wrote about this, they said Isaac was a son big enough to have resisted his father. But in obedience to his father, he allowed his father to bind him, and he laid down himself upon the altar, willing to let his life be taken. That's exactly what Jesus did. He rode in great triumph. He rode into the praises and to the claims of kingship and messiahship. He rode into all the fulfillment of prophecies. He who then could have raised an army and could have created a kingdom laid down his life because he was ministering unto the Father. And he did so with his very life. He was Sharat, a minister unto the Lord. This is our ultimate act of worship. Paul calls it, and I love it, because if you look at the words, it actually says your reasonable temple worship. The one that makes sense. This is the worship that makes sense because nothing else really matters. All that matters is that you now offer yourselves. That you who are ministering to the Lord say, Lord, here am I. I give up my right to claim. No longer do I want to say, Lord, my way. Lord, my ideas. Lord, but I think, Lord, it's my opinion that. Instead, it should be, Lord, what do you want? Lord, how would you have me to move? Lord, what is your will for my life? And you say, well, that's giving up my personhood. Yes, it is. Unto the Lord. Do you think the Levites suffered? God took care of them. He blessed them. They were special unto the Lord. Why do you think Peter writes what he does in this when he says, you're a special people? You're special because God loves you enough that He wants you consecrated to Him. Because that means if you're consecrated to God, you're going to be closer to God than people who are not consecrated to God. You're going to have the experience of the Holy One in your life. You're going to have the Divine One working through you and working in you. And let me tell you, folks, when we leave this world, we're not going to care one little bitty bit about what level we achieved in our job, or how many children we had, or how much money we had, or how many cars we bought. That's not going to matter. What's going to matter is where we are in Him. And He says, you see, as a kingdom of priests, I give you the chance to come and abide with me, to dwell in my house forever, to be my people, interceding and revealing, proclaiming and celebrating. All because our high priest, who had every right to claim glory, instead ministered unto the Father. In obedience, He laid down His life as a sacrifice for the remainder of us. You see, one thing we have to remember, once you lay down your life as a sacrifice, it doesn't belong to you anymore. When you put a sacrifice on the altar, it belongs to the one you're giving it to, not to the giver. I mean, it's consumed. It belongs to the Lord. And if we're willing to lay our lives on the altar as a sacrifice, that means we become consumed by God. And He takes over. And when He takes over, there's no place for unforgiveness. There's no place for hurt feelings. There's no place for anger. There's no place for bitterness. There's no place for sorrow. Because in Him, we find fulfillment and we find peace. That doesn't mean that we still won't face difficult times. It doesn't mean that we won't have sorrowful moments or that we won't grieve like everyone else. But it means in Him, our lives are going to be different because we've laid on the altar as the sacrifice. I mean, if He's willing to do that for us, shouldn't we be willing to do that for Him? The greatest act of worship is to say, God, take my attitude. It's yours. God, take my likes and my dislikes. They're yours. God, take my fears. They're yours. God, take my struggles. They're yours. I offer myself to you as a living sacrifice. I do not want to be conformed to the world any longer, but I want to be transformed. I want to be changed so that I am a consecrated, sanctified, set apart, holy priest unto the Lord, able to do everything that He wants, everything that He says. He is now our inheritance. He is now our hope. All because Jesus did not consider it beneath Him to offer Himself as a sacrifice. He became the Lamb for us so that we might be set apart, a priest unto the Lord. God wants our worship. He wants our acts of worship. He wants our submission and our yielding. He wants the labor of our hands. He wants the choices of our lives, but He also wants us. Not just the things we do. He wants us to be a people whom He can possess, live in and live through, to bless, to lead, to teach, and to use so that others may see His glory and be brought into the fold. Christ died for them, just like He died for us. He died that all men might have life. They will simply turn and say, I'm willing to be the sacrifice. I'm willing to give you my life. I yield. I now belong to you. And Paul says, brothers, that is what worship is all about.